In the early months of 1943, in a cramped steel hull somewhere beneath the gray swell of the North Atlantic, a German submarine crew waited in silence. Above them, the ocean that had once been their hunting ground had begun to turn against them. For 3.5 years, the U-boats of Nazi Germany's Kriegsmarine had stalked Allied convoys with near impunity, sinking merchant ships faster than Britain and the United States could build them. But by the spring of 1943, something had changed in the water above these submerged hulls. The hunters had become the hunted. This is the story of the hunter-killer groups, the specialized Allied naval task forces built to end the U-boat menace, and of what the German submariners who faced them would later describe as the most feared development of the entire naval war. To understand why the hunter-killer groups became so terrifying to the men of the U-Bootwaffe, it is necessary to understand the war they had been winning. From September 1939 onward, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's submarine force, had built his strategy around a simple mathematical premise. Britain was an island nation that depended entirely on merchant shipping for food, fuel, and the raw materials of war. If German submarines could sink merchant tonnage faster than Allied shipyards could replace it, Britain would eventually be starved into surrender regardless of what happened on any battlefield. Dönitz called this the tonnage war, and for the first 3 years of the conflict, it very nearly worked. German U-boats, hunting in coordinated formations that came to be known as wolf packs, would gather intelligence on convoy routes, position themselves in long picket lines across the shipping lanes, and then converge at night to attack in overwhelming numbers. A convoy escorted by only a handful of destroyers or corvettes had little ability to fight off 6 or 8 submarines, attacking simultaneously from different bearings in darkness. The Allied response through 1940, 1941, and into 1942 was fundamentally defensive. Merchant ships sailed in convoys because ships traveling together with armed escorts were statistically safer than ships traveling alone, but the escort vessels assigned to these convoys were themselves few in number, poorly equipped for sustained submarine hunting, and tethered to the convoy they protected. When a U-boat was detected by sonar, which the British called ASDIC, the escorting destroyer or corvette could break off to attack it, but only for a short period. The escort could not abandon the convoy for an extended hunt, because doing so would leave the merchant ships without protection against other submarines already shadowing the formation. This meant that even when a warship succeeded in driving a U-boat underwater and forcing it into a defensive posture, the submarine very often escaped once the escort turned back to rejoin its charges. The war at sea, through the worst years, was a war of missed opportunities, where U-boats were frequently detected but rarely destroyed. There was also a physical gap in Allied protection that German crews learned to exploit with deadly precision. Land-based aircraft flying from bases in Britain, Iceland, and Newfoundland could patrol convoys near the coasts, but their range was limited by the technology of the day. In the middle of the North Atlantic, hundreds of miles from the nearest airfield, there existed a stretch of open ocean that no aircraft could reach. Allied sailors called it the Mid-Atlantic Gap, and German submariners called it the Black Pit, because it was there, beyond the reach of aircraft, that wolf packs could gather and attack with the least fear of being caught on the surface, where a U-boat was fastest but also most vulnerable to detection. The German submarine fleet of this period was built around several classes of vessel, most significantly the Type VII, a medium ocean-going boat about 75 meters long that formed the backbone of Dönitz's Atlantic force, and the larger Type IX, used for longer-range operations. These were not true submarines in the modern sense. They were surface vessels capable of submerging for limited periods, propelled by diesel engines while surfaced and by slower electric motors while submerged, and they needed to surface regularly to recharge their batteries and refresh their air. This single fact would prove central to their eventual defeat, because every time a U-boat came to the surface, even briefly, it became detectable and killable in ways that Allied technology was steadily improving upon. The men who introduced the naval world to the concept of hunting submarines rather than merely defending against them were a combination of British and American commanders and scientists working, at first separately and later in close coordination, toward the same goal. Admiral Sir Max Horton, who took command of Britain's Western Approaches Command in November 1942, had himself served as a submarine commander in the First World War, and he understood from first-hand experience how a submarine thought and how it could be trapped. Horton argued for a fundamental change in doctrine. Rather than treating escort vessels purely as a defensive screen bound to the convoy, he proposed forming dedicated support groups, additional warships free of the responsibility of shepherding merchant ships, whose sole purpose was to reinforce convoys under attack, and then remain in the area to hunt down any submarine detected, pursuing it for as long as necessary until it was destroyed or forced to break contact permanently. This was the conceptual birth of what would become known as the Hunter-Killer Group. On the American side of the Atlantic, the United States Navy under Fleet Admiral Ernest King pursued a parallel and complementary solution rooted in a different technology, the escort carrier. These vessels, built on merchant hull designs and displacing roughly one-third the tonnage of a full fleet carrier, could not fight a major naval battle, but they could carry a squadron of a dozen or more aircraft, and an aircraft carrier attached to a hunting group solved the range problem that had plagued convoy defense since the war began. An escort carrier operating with its own group of destroyers no longer needed to stay near a coastline to receive air cover. It brought its air cover with it, closing the mid-Atlantic gap wherever it sailed. The lead vessel of the most successful American escort carrier class, USS Bog, entered service in September 1942, and by early 1943 she was operating as the flagship of dedicated anti-submarine task groups built specifically to hunt U-boats rather than simply screen merchant convoys. Before these ideas matured into an effective system, however, there were real failures, real losses, and real lessons learned at high cost. As early as September 1939, in the opening weeks of the war, the Royal Navy attempted an early version of an independent hunting group by sending the large fleet carrier HMS Courageous to patrol for U-boats with a screen of only 4 destroyers. On the 17th of that month, U-29, commanded by Otto Schuhart, torpedoed Courageous, sinking her with the loss of more than 500 sailors. Lesson was immediate and painful. A large, valuable capital ship operating independently without the layered protection of a full battle fleet was itself a target of extraordinary value to a patient submarine commander, and the Royal Navy abandoned fleet carrier hunting patrols for the remainder of the war. The concept of the Hunter-Killer Group would have to wait for smaller, more expendable, more numerous escort carriers, and for far better methods of finding the enemy before he found you. Technology, not tactics alone, would ultimately make the hunter-killer concept work, and several separate innovations converged in late 1942 and early 1943 to create the conditions for German defeat. High-frequency direction finding, known to sailors as Huff-Duff, allowed escort ships to detect the radio transmissions that U-boats used to report convoy sightings to their command, and to calculate a bearing toward the transmitting submarine with enough accuracy to send ships in pursuit. Centimetric radar, a wavelength innovation developed by British scientists including the physicists behind the cavity magnetron, could detect a U-boat's conning tower on the surface at night or in fog, at ranges the Germans did not believe were achievable, stripping away the safety of darkness that submarines had always relied upon. The Lee Light, an airborne searchlight developed by squadron leader Humphrey de Verd Lee, allowed aircraft to illuminate a radar-detected submarine in the final seconds of an attack run, closing the gap between detection and destruction. And behind much of this, though its existence remained secret for decades after the war, lay the code-breaking work of the British Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park, whose penetration of the German Enigma cipher, particularly the naval four-rotor variant used by U-boat command, allowed Allied planners at times to reroute convoys around known wolfpack concentrations and to vector hunting groups directly toward reported submarine positions. None of these tools alone would have won the Battle of the Atlantic. It was their combination, operating together within the Hunter-Killer Group concept, that broke the German submarine offensive. A support group, whether built around an escort carrier or simply a half-dozen fast, well-equipped destroyers and sloops, could receive intelligence of a submarine's approximate location from direction-finding fixes or decrypted signals, use aircraft or surface radar to pin down its exact position, and then commit to a sustained pursuit lasting hours rather than minutes, because these ships, unlike ordinary convoy escorts, had no other duty pulling them away. The pivotal test of this new doctrine came in the North Atlantic convoy battles of the winter and spring of 1943. In March of that year, German wolfpacks inflicted what appeared to be a catastrophic defeat on convoys HX-229 and SC-122, sinking 22 merchant ships in a matter of days with the loss of only 1 U-boat. British planners at the Admiralty, reviewing the disaster, briefly questioned whether the convoy system itself could survive. Yet the escort reinforcements, radar sets, and Huff-Duff equipment then entering service in large numbers were only beginning to reach the fleet, and the support groups that Horton had been assembling were only weeks away from full deployment. The following month, in April 1943, escort carrier USS Bog began operations as the centerpiece of Task Group 21.14, and on the 16th of that month her aircraft used a newly issued acoustic homing torpedo to sink U-boat U-175, the first submarine destroyed by a purely American escort carrier task group, followed weeks later by the destruction of U-569. It was in this same period that a Royal Navy officer named Captain Frederick John Walker took command of a new formation called the Second Support Group, built around his own sloop, HMS Starling, together with additional sloops and Flower-class corvettes. Walker was not a young officer marked for rapid promotion in peacetime terms. He had been passed over for command earlier in his career and had spent years convinced his active service was finished. Given a second chance in February 1943, he brought to the role an obsessive, almost mathematical approach to submarine hunting that would make his name synonymous among German U-boat crews who survived encounters with him, with the phrase that a submarine caught by his group would not be allowed to escape. Walker developed and refined a technique he called the creeping attack, later given the operational codename Operation Plaster. Rather than the traditional method of a single ship charging directly over a submerged contact to drop depth charges, a method that forced the attacking vessel to lose sonar contact in the final seconds of its run, Walker's creeping attack used two ships working together. One ship held steady sonar contact with the submerged U-boat from a distance, calling range and bearing instructions by radio to a second ship, which then approached slowly, at a speed low enough that the submarine's hydrophone operators might not immediately register the threat, and dropped a large pattern of depth charges set to explode at the calculated depth, all while the first ship maintained continuous contact throughout the entire attack. Because sonar contact was never broken, a U-boat caught in a properly executed creeping attack had no reliable way to maneuver clear before the charges arrived. Walker's own group would eventually be credited with sinking at least 14 confirmed U-boats under his direct command, a number without parallel among Allied naval officers of the war. The first submarine destroyed by Walker's Second Support Group came in early June 1943, when direction-finding fixes led the group to U-202, commanded by Günter Poser, one of the more experienced U-boat commanders still operating in the Atlantic. Poser and roughly two-thirds of his crew survived to become prisoners of war, and in later correspondence, Poser himself would describe the day his boat was cornered as one from which there had been no possible avenue of escape once the British ships had established their contact. Within the same month, Starling's crew accounted for the destruction of U-119, which was both depth-charged and rammed, and U-449 was destroyed by other ships of the group on the same day. By November 1943, the Second Support Group had sunk U-226 and U-842 in a single engagement, and by the final week of January and the whole of February 1944, in what became the most concentrated anti-submarine achievement of any single formation in the war. Walker's ship sank 6 U-boats in one 27-day patrol, including 3 submarines, U-238, U-734, and U-762, destroyed within a single 15-hour period on the 9th of February 1944 alone. The psychological effect of these operations on the German submarine service was severe, and according to surviving records and post-war interrogation reports of captured crews, deeply demoralizing. U-boat command in Germany had trained its men to expect danger, but the earlier years of the war had at least offered submariners realistic odds of survival and a fighting chance to strike back before being detected. What changed by mid-1943 was the sense, widely reported among captured crews interrogated by British naval intelligence, that a submarine driven under by aircraft or picked up by a support group's Huff-Duff fix stood almost no chance of escaping once contact was firmly established. Interrogation summaries from 1944 describing survivors of boats sunk near the Bay of Biscay recorded crews who had come to view aircraft patrols over their transit routes with a kind of resigned dread, since a submarine forced to dive repeatedly during a Biscay crossing exhausted its batteries and its crew long before reaching open water, leaving it more vulnerable, not less, to the surface hunting groups waiting beyond. Bay of Biscay transits became so dangerous by the second half of 1943 that German command records referred to losses there as a drain on the force independent of losses suffered in convoy battles proper, with roughly 32 submarines destroyed in that stretch of water between May and the end of 1943 alone. The cumulative statistics of the U-boat war, once total, tell their own story of what German crews increasingly understood to be an unwinnable position by the time hunter-killer groups reached full strength. Of the roughly 863 U-boats committed to the Atlantic campaign across the war, the overwhelming majority, more than 750, were eventually destroyed. Of the nearly 41,000 men who served in the German submarine arm, the branch that Dönitz proudly called his volunteer elite, more than 27,000 were killed, a fatality rate higher than that suffered by any other branch of any combatant nation's armed forces in the entire war. By some post-war estimates that include losses through the final year of fighting, as many as 79% of all men who ever served aboard an operational U-boat did not survive the war. Surviving crewmen and post-war historians alike came to refer to the submarines themselves, only half in dark humor, as iron coffins, a phrase that reflected both the physical reality of a badly damaged boat sinking with its crew sealed inside, and the broader psychological reality that service in the U-boat arm after 1943 amounted, statistically, to a death sentence deferred only by luck. May 1943 stands as the decisive turning point in this collapse, and German naval records themselves labeled it a catastrophe. 43 U-boats were lost that month, representing roughly a quarter of Germany's entire operational submarine strength at the time, a loss rate nearly triple the worst previous month of the war, and greater than the total number of boats lost in all of 1941 combined. Some historians of the German Navy privately referred to the month as the Stalingrad of the U-boat arm, a comparison meant to convey the sense of irreversible strategic defeat that Stalingrad represented on land. Of the roughly 2,000 men aboard the boats lost that month, the overwhelming majority died, with only a small fraction surviving to be rescued or captured. Admiral Dönitz, who had earlier in the war celebrated his aces publicly and encouraged an image of the U-boat service as an untouchable elite, was forced at the end of May to withdraw the bulk of his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes entirely, a tacit admission that the tonnage race, the central strategic bet of Germany's naval war, had been lost. Dönitz attributed the disaster in his own post-war writing to what he called the enemy's superiority in location instruments and the surprise made possible by attacks from the air, an oblique but clear acknowledgement of the radar, direction finding, and escort carrier technology that the hunter-killer groups had brought together. Validation of the new doctrine continued to accumulate through the second half of 1943 and into 1944, and the hunting groups expanded rapidly in number as escort carriers and destroyer escorts came off American shipyards in growing numbers. Beyond USS Bog, additional escort carriers including USS Card, USS Core, and USS Croatan formed the nucleus of further task groups, each pairing a small carriers Avenger torpedo bombers and Wildcat fighters with a screen of fast destroyers whose depth-charge projectors and later, the ahead-thrown Hedgehog mortar system gave them the ability to attack a submerged contact without losing sonar contact during the attack run itself, addressing the same tactical problem that Walker's creeping attack had solved from the surface ship side of the Atlantic. American hunter-killer groups working the mid-Atlantic and the approaches to the Caribbean and West Africa achieved a string of successes through 1943 and 1944. Sinking multiple U-boats, and in one especially notable operation in June 1944, the escort carrier group built around USS Guadalcanal, commanded by Captain Daniel V. Gallery succeeded in forcing U-505 to the surface off the West African coast and capturing the submarine intact, along with a working Enigma cipher machine and current codebooks, in what remains the only capture of an enemy warship on the high seas by the United States Navy since the War of 1812. The strategic and human impact of the hunter-killer campaign extended far beyond the raw statistics of ships sunk. Every convoy that reached Britain intact carried food, fuel, aircraft parts, and the men and materiel that would eventually make possible the invasion of continental Europe. Historians estimate that Allied merchant fleets completed more than 300,000 individual voyages across the Atlantic during the war, the overwhelming majority of them arriving safely, a supply lifeline without which the build-up for the Normandy landings in June 1944 would have been far slower and far more precarious. When Walker's second support group was assigned to help secure the sea approaches to Normandy during the first critical weeks after the invasion, not a single U-boat succeeded in penetrating the screen his ships and supporting aircraft maintained. A fact that reflected how completely the balance of the Atlantic War had shifted from 1940, when U-boats moved almost freely among the convoys, to 1944, when a concentrated hunting group could seal an entire stretch of ocean against submarine attack. The cost of this campaign, even in victory, fell heavily on the men who fought it from the surface as well. Captain Walker himself, driven by an intensity of effort that colleagues and subordinates alike described as relentless, collapsed from what naval physicians recorded as overstrain, exhaustion, and cumulative battle fatigue, and died on the 9th of July 1944. Only weeks after his group's success off the Normandy beaches, having never lost a single ship to enemy action while under his direct tactical command, though he had lost men to the sea itself and to accidents in the brutal conditions of North Atlantic operations. His death was mourned publicly in Liverpool, the port city that had come to regard his ship's returns, greeted by cheering crowds of merchant sailors, dockworkers, and servicewomen along the Gladstone dock, as moments of genuine civic celebration in the midst of a war that had, for years before his group's successes, offered the city mostly grief. The technological and doctrinal lessons of the hunter-killer campaign did not end with the German surrender in May 1945. As the Second World War gave way almost immediately to the tensions of the Cold War, the United States Navy recognized that the Soviet Union was rapidly building its own large submarine fleet, in part using captured German U-boat designs and the German engineers who had built them. The same operational logic that had defeated Donitz's Atlantic force, dedicated task groups combining aircraft, sonar, and fast surface escorts operating independently of convoy duty, was formalized into permanent Cold War anti-submarine doctrine. Escort carriers gave way over the following decade to larger, purpose-modified vessels, and by the early 1950s, the United States Navy had begun reclassifying decommissioned Essex-class fleet carriers as dedicated anti-submarine warfare carriers, designated CVS. Each embarking a specialized carrier anti-submarine air group equipped with sonobuoys, magnetic anomaly detection gear, and eventually early ship-based helicopters, extending the hunter-killer concept into an era of nuclear-powered submarines that could remain submerged far longer than any Type VII or Type IX U-boat ever built by Germany. That lineage continues into the present day in a less visible but structurally identical form. Modern naval task groups built around aircraft carriers still assign dedicated anti-submarine assets, maritime patrol aircraft, and surface escorts to hunt submarine threats using principles directly descended from the support groups Max Horton assembled and the escort carrier task forces Ernest King's Navy sent to sea in 1943. NATO's standing maritime forces and the anti-submarine training standards followed by Allied navies today trace their conceptual origin to the specific realization reached in the darkest months of the Battle of the Atlantic, that a submarine could not simply be deterred or evaded. It had to be found, held under continuous contact, and destroyed by forces free to pursue it without competing responsibility, exactly the doctrine that transformed a defensive convoy war into an offensive hunting campaign. The German submariners who survived encounters with the Second Support Group, with the escort carrier task groups of the American Atlantic Fleet, or with any of the dozens of hunting formations the Allies fielded by 1944, left behind in post-war memoirs and prisoner interrogation records, and in the private correspondence some of them later shared with the historians and family members of their former adversaries, a consistent account of what those groups represented. They described an enemy that no longer waited passively for a submarine to attack and then reacted, an enemy that came looking, that found a boat through means the crews often did not fully understand until after the war, and that once a contact was made, simply did not let go. For men who had joined the U-boat service in 1940 or 1941, under the confident promise that they belonged to an elite arm capable of starving Britain into submission, the arrival of the hunter-killer groups in 1943 marked the moment the war beneath the waves turned irreversibly against them. And it did so not through a single dramatic battle, but through the patient, coordinated application of radar, direction-finding, code-breaking, and relentless pursuit that no submarine of that era, however well-built or well-crewed, could ultimately outrun. The problem that began this story, the vulnerability of a defensive convoy system unable to hunt down the submarines stalking it, was solved not by a single invention, but by the deliberate fusion of several technologies and one uncompromising operational idea: that the ocean itself, once thought too vast to control, could be made a closed space for any submarine unlucky enough to be detected within it. That idea, tested and proven in the North Atlantic between 1943 and 1945, remains in its essential form the foundation of anti-submarine warfare to this day, a quiet inheritance from a campaign whose true measure was recorded not only in the tonnage of ships sunk, but in the accounts of the German crews who came to understand, often in their final moments, that the hunters had at last become the hunted.